without further ado, I have a great guest today, Noah Henderson. How are you doing, Noah?
I'm doing well. I'm out here in Chicago. It's freezing cold, but we're getting through the winter.
Let's go to what you've done, and you've done quite a bit. You write for Sports Illustrated and NIL deals, and you have a sports management gig with Loyola Chicago. So I have to say, you have the dream job, Sports Illustrated. Since I was 5 years old, I would have loved to write for Sports Illustrated. Well, let's get to the topic. You wrote a very interesting article about the activity on the West Coast of two conferences, Mountain West and the WCC, and how they were pretty much gutted out, and the Atlantic 10 is in position to take the helm as the number one mid-major.
Good. Yeah, so I wrote this article as a preseason piece, right when we had a lot of the upheaval on the West Coast with a little bit surprising reformation of the Pac-12, very much a football-driven decision-making process from schools like San Diego State, Boise State, right? Abandoning the Mountain West where they've been for quite some time to join Washington State, Oregon State, and kind of that old Pac-12 intellectual property and history legacy, right? Power Five, imagery, and join. Probably going to get a lot more lucrative media deal, have more resources. So for them, it made sense. Moving outside of that, you saw Gonzaga jump ship as well, right? Leaving the WCC to join the Pac-12. Now, they're obviously only going to be a basketball member. That was more of a basketball and monetary-driven decision for Gonzaga. And while most of this was football-driven, money-driven, what you're going to see is the Mountain West, who, at least for the last 3 or 4 years, has really been the preeminent mid-major conference, kind of get fractured. You're still going to have some really solid programs stay in the Mountain West, right? You're going to have a New Mexico team that looks solid, doesn't look to slow down. I think Pitino's doing a great job. UNLV, right? There's teams in the Mountain West that are still going to remain, but you have those bottom teams that are really going to drag the aggregate of the conference down, your Air Forces, right? So on and so forth, that just make the Mountain West not what it used to be. They're not going to send 6 teams to the tournament like they did last year. On top of that, the WCC has been held up by Gonzaga. Now, St. Mary's, San Francisco, both very good basketball teams, right? Well-run programs that will likely be good. But when you look at the WCC, again, they have their marquee team who's a top 25 every year, really a top 10 every year, and then sprinkle in a ranked St. Mary's or maybe a ranked San Francisco. But the bottom of that conference, again, doesn't really stack up to the depth that we have in the A10, right? You don't have 10 teams in the top 100 or 150 like the A10 is capable of and even does this year in the WCC. So you're looking at, right, these two conferences who once could really challenge the A10, in my opinion. The Mountain West definitely delivered a better product. The WCC maybe was comparable, are going to fall out of favor. But beyond this realignment, there's other factors that are kind of going into this, in what I call this new A10 surge that we're going to have, which is revenue sharing that begins next year.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So if you look at schools in the Mountain West, right, a lot of them are going to be making football-driven decision-making. Ultimately, that's where the money comes from. Now, a team like San Diego State might invest more into their basketball team than their football team, but a school like Boise State sure won't. And I think that for another mid-major basketball conference, say the American, right, someone else who has put together team Memphis, right, good Memphis teams and other teams that have been solid tournament contenders, those resources that are ultimately now not coming from NIL collectives, right? Next year, we're going to have revenue sharing from the institutions, not collectives. Let me be clear on that.
Okay.
The majority of that focus and that funding is going to go to football and the AAC, which really leaves the A10 to do what they've always done, invest in their basketball programs and really have more financial resources to spend. And ultimately, the real victors out of this are probably going to be the Big East, right? Teams with a lot of financial backing, both from donors and from just their media rights contract. to be able to pay their players really handsomely without having to worry about, splitting the pot between basketball and football. That's a problem that's been going on forever. I mean, it was a problem that really plagued the Pac-12 in a way. The Pac-12 collapsed due to some prudent decisions when it came to their media rights deal and how they attacked the Pac-12 network, where their media payouts weren't as good. There's kind of, I hate to call them free riders, but there are free riders in every conference, right? Ultimately, someone's going to be at the bottom. The process, I don't know. I can't speak for every conference because I haven't read every conference's contract, but the process for kicking a team out is rather challenging. Could there be a split where certain teams all jump and reform into a new conference? Maybe. I've heard rumblings that certain institutions within the A10 next year are so adamantly opposed to revenue sharing that they might bow out entirely. The A10 hasn't, at least nothing that I've heard yet. There's been discussions that they might make it mandatory. It might be a conference rule that you have to, right, kind of have this NIL revenue share, like a salary floor. Like it's a rule that if you want to be in this conference, you have to spend X amount of dollars on your student athletes and their compensation, which, let's be realistic, in the A10, that's only basketball. So, right, you have to spend $1.5 million every year on funding a basketball team. That's a number that has not been thrown out. That's a number that I'm using as a jumping off point. But right, there could be something like that, and an institution who either, certain institutions I've heard might be like ethically or against their institution's mission to compensate athletes like that, might bow out. So it just depends on what the A10 as a conference decides to do in this arena. It depends. That could be one way to push schools out, is through some form of salary floor that's required. And it might not be feasible for some schools, or for other schools that just might not want to do it. But, I think it's important moving forward for the conference that you have everyone in it together, right? Especially in this new paradigm of college sports where everyone's going to have a payroll, right? This is going to be professional sports, at least in the way that, student athletes will still go to class, they'll still be enrolled, they'll still do all of that in the way that they've always done, but you're going to have a payroll, right? VCU came out a couple of weeks ago and said they're aiming to have a $5 million annual payroll for their athletes.
That was a question coming up for you from one of our fans of the show.
Yeah, and so, you're going to have to go, well, if you can't, meet us a quarter of the way there and, fund a team that can compete in this conference and can compete for a bid, then, you really don't get to be in this conference, because, right, we're playing ball, or at least trying to play ball with the big boys, and, you need to be all in on that. I think that there's significant issues with revenue sharing that really challenge every school. One is some schools might think that it deprives them of their academic mission, while others, with revenue sharing also comes roster limitations. So if you opt into revenue sharing, you also opt into roster limits, right? For the entire history of college sports, you never had roster limits, you had scholarship limits. So you could have as many walk-ons as you wanted, right? In football, you have like 125 players, but only 85 are on scholarship. So if you opt in, there's a lot of student athletes that unfortunately will probably have to get cut, and that's across, right, non-revenue sports as well. Like tennis, golf are prime examples of sports that, right, if St. Joe's opts into this revenue sharing system, they also opt into this roster limitation, and 40 athletes across all of their sports might not have a home next year to play because for the first time there's roster limitations. They made golf 9 when I was at St. Joe's. We held a team of 10 or 11 every year I was there. Those are 2 roster spots for athletes that won't be there. So, revenue sharing, important for basketball, also has its drawbacks, and making those phone calls to athletes, really displacing a lot of student athletes in soccer, golf, etc., that I think isn't really palatable, might not be palatable for admin, might not be palatable for donors who see the headlines of Rhode Island cuts 35 student athletes for revenue sharing, right? That's a pretty negative headline that could be impactful to an image. And again, right, this is out of the control of these athletic directors' hands. It's a rock and a hard place. Do I want a revenue share? Of course I do, but do I want to cut 50 athletes across the board at our school? Well, no, I really don't. I think the scale, at least from what I've heard in the A10, is tipping towards no, we have to revenue share, right? As unfortunate as it is that 3 people on our women's soccer team are going to be cut, in order for us to exist in this new paradigm, we have to, revenue share. And I've been doing a lot of advocacy work on my own to get them.
I noticed.
To drop that roster limit stuff, because it's
roster limitation is your big thing.
It is. It's a sticking point. The A10's positioned really well to compete. Every Power 5 school also has football. You have a $20.5 million salary cap that, granted this House settlement that's been all over the news, is formally approved on April 7th. You're going to have a $20.5 million NIL cap to spend. 70 on football, 20% on basketball, 5% on women's basketball, and 5% to other sports.
Wow.
So, 70% is a hefty figure for football. And, will Kansas spend 70% on football? Maybe they might chip in a little bit more to their basketball program. But roughly, that's pretty much what's going to be expected of schools, is that proportionality. VCU is even going above what probably most Power 5 schools will spend on basketball. $3.5 million is really all you need to have, that elite level basketball spending money to compete with others. Now, that brings in the question of the Big East, who's resourced so well and doesn't have football. How much are they going to, want to spend? Which is why I think the Big East could really be in a good position here, because, well, they're the most resourced and can spend up to $20.5 million. Now, will any Big East school spend that much? Probably not. I don't think that would ever happen, but they could probably get to 7, and that would kind of surpass many Power 5 teams and what they're going to spend on basketball, or virtually all of them. So, I think that the climb to get to 3 million is not incredibly hard for schools in the A10 and the lesser funded part of the A10, right? It's not an easy ask, but those funds aren't necessarily only coming from the TV rights deal either, right? This is money that was, as of this year, going to the NIL collective that can now be diverted to the athletics fund and used for revenue sharing. And even better news is that, right, the athletics fund is a charitable entity. They're a 501c3. Most NIL collectives, if you were doing it, according to the IRS guidelines, are not 501c3. There are some that have tried and they've not fared very well in the eyes of the law. But right now, you're going to have boosters who would be even more inclined to give to funding team resources and team payment, because, well, now it's a charitable donation. So if I'm someone whose name's on a building at one of these A10 schools, I have my own dorm hall with my last name on it. Now, when I contribute to athlete payment, it would be, a charitable write-off.
One thing that the Rhody board says is, how do we know what's accurate or what's not? These are just things that are going on, and they pointed specifically to VCU, and they're not the only ones. There's a lot of people that want more veracity and know for sure that this is true. Who is saying that each player is going to be making $350,000? Where is that coming from? Can we attribute a source? That they're a little jaded when it comes to the NIL reports.
That is ultimately the hardest thing. And, as someone who worked for an NIL collective and wrote those contracts, nobody knows what athletes are getting paid unless the athlete tells you. I think a lot of people make the mistake. I think On3 is a phenomenal service, but On3 is not accurate. On3 is an algorithm that looks at your Instagram following and your team ranking and spits out a number of your valuation, right? It's speculative. They don't know. Now, again, is it helpful? Sure. But I think a lot of people will look at those On3 values and go, oh, this player's making $7 million this year. No, they're not. the reports that you hear, unless you see a contract, you really don't know.
Yeah.
I think that it makes sense for a lot of athletes to inflate them because then the whole market gets inflated. But yeah, it's a lot of posturing in a way of what we're doing, what we're going to be paying, right? Look at us, look at me. And that's not to target VCU at all. Who knows? They might have $5 million that they're eagerly willing to spend and have all that. I think, again, a lot of schools in the A10, especially the better resource ones, will be in a good position to spend in ways that maybe they haven't even been able to spend through their collective, just based on, how their boosters want to handle this. So, take everything with a grain of salt, right? These are not publicly disclosed in any manner and likely won't be anytime soon, at least until there's collective bargaining in college sports. So you can't believe what anyone's telling you unless they work for the collective and they're telling you things they shouldn't, or, somehow a contract gets leaked or into the hands of, Rothstein or something and they report on it. But, outside of a very credible source, I wouldn't give it too much credence. I don't know what that would look like, if it does manifest. Obviously would have implications on March Madness and the tournament and all of that. The NCAA and the Power Four conferences have a very unique relationship. Right? The NCAA makes $0 off of FBS level football. Right. The NCAA only makes their money through the March Madness tournament and, media rights for select other championships that are broadcasted that are quite nominal in comparison. Wow. Yeah. So,
interesting.
Because the college football playoff and all those bowl games are private entities. They're privately held and they distribute money to the schools, tremendous money to the schools, but they are privately held. The NCAA doesn't, they control the rules and regulations, but they don't fund or have really any involvement in the championship of football. But as far as the Power Four split goes, I think it's a bit of frustration, especially now in this very dynamic, regulatory landscape, that why do we even have to, if we have this vision, and I think a lot of Power Four athletic directors see the only way out of this is kind of a mini professional model, right? Where, look, the transfer portal's messed up. We can't have anyone on anything longer than a 1-year deal, right? Essentially, every player is entering free agency at the end of the season if they want to. Things are moving towards professionalization and more of a business type relationship where we're maximizing profits, having revenue share with our athletes like any other pro sport. What really is the place for the NCAA in all of this? If I'm a Power 4 AD, I want to be able to trade my players. If we're really moving into professional concepts, I'm going to be able to cut players, I'm going to be able to trade them, we're going to collectively bargain. These athletes are going to be employees of the conferences or something, so where we can, right, have more of a pro sports feel to it, if that's the way that, really the courts are taking this.
Yeah.
I think that next year, it could be a conference decision from the top that, hey, we're all revenue sharing next year. It's probably not going to be up to that amount. Definitely won't be a mandated floor of that amount. But, I wouldn't be surprised if Dayton, Loyola, right, schools that are financially in good position, or their athletic departments are financially and relative A10 positioning to, have a $3 million, roughly ballpark, 2 to 4, they're going to be paying athletes. That's happening. So I think that VCU's decision in that report is surprising for the level that they're claiming they'll be doing it, but it's not surprising that they're opting in any way. That could be unanimous across the board.
Well, I always wrap it up by saying, when it comes to Rhody basketball, it's always go St. Joe's. Go Rhody. Well, Noah, thanks for coming in today. This has been phenomenal.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Yes. Well, I could go on longer, but you have a day, so we'll respect that.
All right. Well, take care.
Okay, take care, Noah.